Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and absolutely not any hot takes on Family Guy. At a corner table by the fire are two people. One of them is neurotically tapping his foot and pulling at the corners of his hair. Then, after a final deep breath, he downs the remainder of his drink and prepares to unburden himself of a Family Guy hot take. And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. I find Seth MacFarlane extremely frustrating. He is, among other things, the creator of Family Guy. That's a show that many men of my generation have this extreme cult of personality like devotion to. I've never really liked it. It's not just because it's crass, although it certainly is. It's because it seems to have this deep seated nihilism at its core. It will tell any joke at anybody's expense, just so long as it'll get the next laugh. If I were to summarize the show's ethos, it would be LOL, nothing matters, which is a shame because Seth MacFarlane is genuinely very talented. When he gets a hold of a project that he actually seems to care about, say that Family Guy Star Wars parody, it's really amazing and remarkable. They show the true breadth of his talent. Oh well. I guess you can chalk that up to yet another soul dashed up against the rocks of materialist ennui. Cut to me staring off into the sunset with a pensive expression. So you can imagine my shock when I found this pretty recent statement from Seth MacFarlane. He was on some podcast and he was talking about how he feels that Hollywood's shows do not have enough hope in them. He says, "That's why I did The Orville," his new show. "Because when I was a kid, Hollywood was providing that voice in various forms. There was a lot of hope, and some of the blame lies right here in this town. The dishes that we are serving up are so dystopian and so pessimistic. And yeah, there's a lot to be pessimistic about, but it's so one-sided. There's nothing we're doing that's providing anyone an image of hope." This is not something I say too often, but I agree with Seth MacFarlane. I've been thinking about this issue from an angle that is related but distinct, from the angle of joy. I think so many of our stories, especially the serious ones that serious people give each other awards about, are distinctly lacking in joy. And I think that's a big problem, especially when we view the vocation of storytelling from a Christian perspective. Fortunately, our guest today knows all about joy. Shemaiah Gonzales is a writer with degrees in English literature, intercultural ministry, and creative nonfiction. Her work has appeared in America Magazine, Image Journal's Good Letters, Ecstasis, The Curator, and Loyola Press, among others. Oh, this might be interesting. In 2018, a story she wrote about her college English professor was selected by Pope Francis, ever heard of him, to be included in his book, Sharing the Wisdom of Time. And, as concerns us most right now, in April 2025, her book, Undaunted Joy, The Revolutionary Act of Cultivating Delight, which is a collection of essays, was published with Zondervan HarperCollins. Shemaiah Gonzales, welcome to the Anselm Society Digital Pub Table.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And something else I should mention is you came at the personal recommendation of our very own Jane Charles, poet extraordinaire. How do you know Jane?
Jane and I have now I can't remember our original way that we met in person, but both of us went to the same MFA program at SPU, and she a couple of years before me. You know what? I think one time we just had an issue online that we both had an opinion on, and I said, "You wanna call me and talk about it?" And we did. Like, we hadn't met in person yet, and we just talked about it and got on, and since then, we see each other at conferences, and we have a lot of connections with different, Christian, literary organizations, and she's just the best.
She absolutely is. She absolutely is. She was actually a co-host on Believe to See until she went and moved to Michigan. Meh, but we'll get her back sometime. She just doesn't know it yet. So one thing I was curious about, because I described you, I used a pretty generic term, writer, but I was wondering, I thought about essayist, author of creative nonfiction. Maybe we could go like Samuel Johnson, woman of letters.
Wow, I've never heard that one.
Is there a particular title you think would work better than just writer?
Oh, I I I am not lofty enough for woman of letters, not at all. And even sometimes I have a hard time with writer, although or essayist, which I am, but I really think at the heart of all of it is that I'm a storyteller. I like to tell stories. And there was a lady that used to come to my, school when I was a kid, and, I went to a small little Christian school in Southern California, and she would, come to our chapels and tell stories, and I was like, "One day I wanna be like that lady. I just wanna go up and tell stories to people." She was so captivating. I'll never get to that level, but, she's my inspiration, Mrs. Dalkey.
I love that. I love this. So one particular story, I mean, I have to ask you about this before we get to the main part of the interview. How did the Pope find your story and put it in his book?
Oh my goodness, that was so weird. I wrote for, Loyola Press for many years and continue to do so, and, I had an online blog where I wrote a story about this English professor, and, one of the editors from Loyola Press from that actual book, she was trying to find stories, read my blog post and reached out to me, and it was funny because I didn't know her, she was an editor I hadn't worked with, and she said, "Can I have a call with you? I have something to talk to you about, but I can't put it in writing." And I'd never met her before. And so I was like, "Of course."
Is she asking me to help fix a horse race or something? What's this about? Yeah.
Right, I have no idea. Someone from Catholic Publishing asking me, I can't write it and write it down. And we had a call and she told me about this project and she said, I love the story that you told because it's a collection of how we learn from our elders. And I learned so much from this professor, not just about English, but about life and just and God's goodness, to be honest with you. And so she asked me if I would go through some edits with her and just put it in the file and hope that the Pope picked it. And so it was she just, like, gave him tons of stories. So there was no, like, promise or, she wasn't the one with the word, and he picked it. I don't even know what that looked like or how it came about, but
I mean, I picture Pope Francis sitting down in the easy chair. He has like a big mug of tea. He's just sort of going through it, and yours just caught his eye, you know?
oh, it was such a gift, and especially that was such a long time ago, and I don't think I was a very good writer at that point in my career, but it's a story that I love and would and want to tell often that this professor came to my wedding when I got married, and
Ooh.
I had had a previous relationship that he had known about, and after the wedding ceremony, he came over and whispered in my ear, "Aren't you glad you didn't marry the other one?" I said, "Oh, yes." So I'm so glad. He was just a wonderful man.
That is fantastic. So now let's talk about this more current project. Again, published April 2025. The title "Undaunted Joy: The Revolutionary Act of Cultivating Delight." So let's start with the big picture. Give us the elevator pitch. What's your book about?
It is a collection of essays on joy and, in sometimes in the mundane and in the magnificent, and, I argue that joy is from God, it's transcendent, and so even those little moments, like my favorite pants, are God trying to reach out to you and grab your attention. And I also write some more theological essays, and they're like the joy of letting God love you and how hard that is. So a lot of the essays are very much about that you need they're they're not they're not I'm trying to think of the word. Um they're not naive. I've gone through a lot of hardship and no one wants to hear about joy in this sort of idyllic way. Um One needs to understand despair and struggle to understand joy, to see the contrast between the 2. And so that's what these essays are about.
Yeah, and I think that that sort of posture is really evident even in the title, right? It's Undaunted Joy, then the revolutionary act of cultivating delight. And I told you before we start recording, I want to go through word for word because I think each of those words is important. But let's start again. Let's keep it big picture because it's I mentioned in my intro we really focus on stories and storytelling on this podcast. So I was wondering if you could give your response to the Seth MacFarlane quotation that I shoehorned in there that I've been mulling over for a long time. Do you think if, assuming we agree that a lot of the art sort of especially in the serious art world, do you agree that there's sort of this deficit of well, he's talking about it from hope. So
Yeah.
we could talk about that distinction if that's important. But do you think that is there? And if so, what do you think the consequences of that are?
Yeah, I was listening to that, quote from McFarlane, and I think we're the same age around.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm unsure of that. I'll look up later. But I feel like we grew up in the 80s, the stories were all about hope, you know? And even the music was. My kids who are teens now, they will listen to my old music or watch my old movies and they love the 80s stuff. It's so buoyant, it's so hopeful, it's joyful. It's got a redemptive message. And then as they move into my college years, of, the music and movies, there's this dystopian message and this
Ooh.
sort of lethargy and just sadness. And, so I identify with that quote a lot, and I feel like it's just gotten worse. And and as Christians, I think it's our calling. I was just in fact, it's a quote I just shared with Jane Charles today because of we'd been talking about this, and I found this quote by James Baldwin where it said that as artists, we bear the responsibility to lighten the darkness, you know, and which many people live in. And he wrote, even if those people are strangers, and even if they want to kill you, which I thought was, like, kinda goes with my undaunted, like, "Bring it on." Like, I'm still gonna show you the way to live, you know? I'm still gonna shine light in the darkness. And, if someone like McFarlane, who I don't think is of a particular faith, can see this in the world, how much more do we need to shine this light and hope and joy? So, yeah, that really I mean, I started writing it down as fast as I could when you were reading that. I'll look it up later.
Yeah, it really took me off guard because again, I think Family Guy is kind of fundamentally nihilistic. That's sort of my fundamental gripe about it, which I think is almost worse than being dark. Because when something's dark, at least it's like, oh, things are not as they should be. Whereas
Yeah.
nihilism's like, whatever, who cares?
Yeah.
But I don't know if this was a transition in his own thinking or if he just finally is getting a chance to express it. But for whatever reason, he's onto something now. And to that point, now let's go with the definitions. When I'm not podcasting, I'm a lawyer, so I love defining words.
Oh my goodness. I'm married to one, so,
Hey, I'm.
I just can't get away from you
You
guys.
can't get away from us. Yeah, my wife used to she was like, I could go to any like law school, lawyer, just like soiree and I could totally blend and I know all the words, right? It's like reasonable doubt, rule 12b6, of all reasonably prudent person. I'm sure you have that skill set too against your will, but
I don't.
oh,
I don't at all.
oh,
In fact, I go to these things and my husband says that I make him more human
oh.
to the rest of the crowd.
That's an important skill when you're around lawyers. I appreciate that. So let's start with the definitions here. Joy. It's one of those words that we all have sort of a conception of it, but I get the feeling you're using it in a very precise way. So what do you mean by the word joy as used throughout your book?
Mhm. Well, joy is different than happiness because it's not dependent on our circumstances or how things are going. It's transcendent. It's something outside of ourselves. It's a view of the world that God has instilled in us. It's a fruit of the spirit.
So now let's get to the other parts of the title here, because again, I think this title is important. So the name of your book, the big title, is Undaunted Joy. Why do
Mhm.
you think it's so important that joy be undaunted?
Hmm. Well, it's so countercultural. It's you just have, I think of those images of, oh gosh, it's funny, but what just came to me is Tank Man standing in front of that tank and like, no, bring it on. You know, I'm fighting for this and you're not going to scare me. I feel like especially in the last 5 years just trying to scare us into not living a full life and to live in fear instead. And I'm like, nope, no, you're not gonna steal my joy, and, you're not gonna take it from me. And there's a lot of stories, in this book too of true stories of dire moments where, in a World War II trench I'm sorry, World War One trench, in, a concentration camp, actually 2 concentration camp stories of people, holding on to joy as an act of defiance.
That's such a good way to look at it, because as we've talked about already, there's this cultural meme. It's just sort of floating in the ether, almost regardless of class, of political affiliation, that like things right now are just dire.
Mm,
There'll be all these serious like New York Times think pieces where they're talking to young people like, well, why would I want to have children? Why do I want to bring them into this world? And it's like, oh, okay, on first of all, surface level stuff in terms of just like economics, healthcare, life expectancy. There's literally never been a better time to bring a child into the world. But beyond that, I think what they're really getting at is this sense of dread, this sense that things are going so wrong, everything is so bleak, everything is so dire that it almost doesn't matter what, the statistics say. There's this feeling in the air that having joy is something that almost takes an act of bravery. I There's this G.K. Chesterton quotation that I'm about to butcher, where it's like
mhm,
something about how in this mixed up age, defending the traditional virtues has all of the thrill of a vice, right? Where it almost takes that sort of attitude. But let's keep pressing on through this title. So you call this a revolutionary act.
mm.
What do you mean by this being revolutionary?
Well, I think you kinda touched on it a little bit, with that Chesterton quote. Uh, it is countercultural, and to, press into joy, to press into virtues, can be quite lonely
Woohoo.
and isolating. And I have experienced all of that during these years of reflecting on this, and actually a lot of struggles as well, which I talk about at the end of the book. It's just so countercultural. It's against what's going on out there, and it's so much easier to give in to everyone else and to the culture and to just be part of it. And I say, "No, let's start a revolution. Let's go the other way." I am very wary of people who talk about that we're in dark times. Times have always been dark. Times have always, and you're not able to see when you talk like that and look like that at the world like that, you're unable to see the abundance that is all around us and to live abundantly. I think of those words from Christ where, like, I've come that you would live abundantly. I was in Mass in England, actually meditating on this. I thought I would write it during that time. And I remember those words from Mass just lingering, sizzling in my mind. And I said, "That's what joy is about. It's about abundance, and we want to live as if we're living in scarcity when we're not." You know?
Yeah, and again, there's you can see how this works on 2 levels. Again, we can look at the economic and, like, life expectancy tables, like, "Guys, you think things are dark. Do you wanna try the bubonic plague, World War I, uh, all the different wars? We're doing pretty good right now." But beyond that, and more seriously, there's, like, the spiritual dimension of that. Like you said, there's regardless of circumstances, there's a joy that you can have, the abundant life that you can have that isn't dependent on whether things happen to be going for you in particular right now.
Yes. I hope that, I mean, I I really struggled spiritually, writing this. I felt a lot of just the world unseen, coming to combat, all of this, and I feel and I write about that, in the book, and I think I stood firm. I think I kept my joy. But when I wonder about circumstances like the ones that I write, like being in a concentration camp
Mhm.
or living through the bubonic plague or being a hostage somewhere, would I still feel God's presence?
Mhm.
Um would I lean into his love, And I hope that all of these little steps, um, I think that they're just trials, so that I can get more and more comfortable with God's grace and his goodness in my life and acknowledge his presence.
Mm.
Because so much of it, of not understanding joy, is not seeing his presence in this world. And so I want to be able to see him now and hope that if it did get darker, I would still see his presence and know that he's there with me.
Yeah, I think, something I heard from my, grandma a few years ago. She just passed away about a year ago, but, she was at this point, several years back where my grandpa passed away, and but then for a while she had a very active social life. She had lots of friends. She was very active. But then she had like, this happens when you reach a certain age for a lot of folks. Like her health just sort of suddenly took a step down, and that was a lot harder for her. So she was in this situation where she had tons of friends. She was always active, and then that was sort of off the table for her.
Mhm.
And something she told me amidst this very hard time was, "Well, just remember, this is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it." It's like she decides, it's like, yeah, I will do this. Like the Lord has made this day. I will rejoice and be glad in it. So it's like that was her posture toward it. Like, yes, I will rejoice. That is what I'm gonna do.
What a woman. That's a great story. And it's like you have to choose that every day, and some days are harder than others, and it's just like you have to choose Jesus every day. You have to choose to carry your cross, and you have to choose joy each day, whether or not it's easy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in taking that, because that's going to be related to this last part of your subtitle here, the revolutionary act of cultivating delight. So, what do you mean by delight? Is it the same as joy? Is it slightly different? Let's get into the nuances here. What? Let's talk about delight.
Well, I'm not sure, to be honest. I wanna focus on the cultivating part because I think that that's always what people have a hard time. Like, "Well, that's all well and good for you, Shemaiah, but how do you get started? How do you cultivate a life of joy?" Um, I think perhaps we just used delight because we don't wanna say joy twice, in the same, uh but it's like, how do you cultivate that lens in which to look through the world, Um, and part of it, I think, is really enjoying the small stuff, you
Mm,
know? I write a story about, how oh gosh, I got really excited about some new trash bags one time when my husband's friend was over, so, again, an attorney, and I'm trying to look fancy in front of him. It was like one of our first dinner guests when we got married, and I'm switching the trash, and I'm like, "Oh, I get to use the new trash bags." And I'm like, "They're stretchy and they smell good." And then I was realized, like, I looked like I was in a commercial, like there was a hidden camera or something. And I was like, "Gosh, I'm such a dork." Like, it's like guy went to Ivy League school and I'm like, "Yay, trash bags?" And he looks at me, grabbed the empty bag because he was gonna take it out for me, and without skipping a beat, he said, "You know what? You gotta get excited about the little stuff because the big stuff doesn't come that often, and when it does, it's usually not good, the big stuff, you know?" And I just thought about that. I was like, "Yeah." And at that point, I had graduated, from college. I'd got fallen in love, gotten married, and a lot of the big stuff had already happened. And at that point in my life, even though I was getting excited about trash bags, I wasn't particularly happy. And that moment just stayed with me for a couple of years. It took a while for me to understand why I was holding on to that moment. And it was that you need to learn how to cultivate these things in your life, a way of looking at life. I There's one chapter that is just a list of 100 things. As I was creating the writing the book, I would think of something that I just saw out there in the world that didn't cost money, that was out there free for everyone to enjoy, that just delighted me. And I started making a list and I said, wouldn't it be fun if I got to 100, by the end of this book? And since I was looking for those moments and I told my family I was looking for those moments, it started being a thing. And so my teen boys would say, "Oh, mom, you should write about panda bears on that list, you know? They're such lovable doofuses." And so I'd start adding those on and I realized, the world is abundant. You just must look. Open your eyes.
I 100% agree, and I think that's really one of the great things. I love that you use the word cultivating because, like you were saying, it implies this thing. It's something you have to practice. You need to be intentional about it over and over and over again until it becomes a habit.
Mhm.
Almost like cultivating a garden. It's something you need to do constantly. You can't just let it go for you can't do like I'm gonna do a bunch of gardening this one weekend and let it go for 3 months. You need to do it daily. It needs to be a constant thing to actively seek out these moments of joy. I just think that's such a useful frame for it. And so now that we have our definitions in order, let's apply this to the stories we tell. Because you mentioned earlier that you view yourself as a storyteller,
Yeah.
which means you're definitely in the right place with this podcast because that's what we try to talk about, the stories. So let's say you're talking to like a young writer, someone else who's trying to tell a story, and they just want to know how they can. I don't even know because can't write a story about joy because that's not how it works. I know that's yeah, but how would you have stories that are infused with joy such that it helps to sort of cultivate this sort of attitude posture toward life that you're looking at?
Yeah. I think recently, uh, a way that I've brought this into my work is looking at writing as an act of worship.
Mm.
And if I'm if I'm trying to create something as an offering that I lay at God's altar, it changes the dynamic of what I'm working on so much, and it infuses my work with joy. Or whatever that is for that artist, whatever that fruit of the spirit is. Um, Sometimes it's just presence. There's some writers, and of course, right now I'm not going to think of them, but whose writing can be quite dark. Um, but there's this sense of God's presence within it. Um, Even though the writer might not even say God or Christ or Jesus in it. Um, but I also think that there's just this lack, like McFarlane, just this lack of storytelling that is joyful. It's I always feel like, how do I oh, I hate using this word, but how do I market myself? Who's like but because there's just not a lot of people that write silly, unhinged, you know, essays, and, there's not a lot of joyful writers out there. I think in some ways, C.S. Lewis was, but he wasn't unhinged and he wasn't silly, but his writing was infused with that joyfulness in it. I also think of the writer, Brian Doyle, who passed away a few years ago, whose writing just oozed with joy and God's presence. And then maybe like, who is it that I cheerfully refuse? Lee Finger. Yeah, his work, and also that, I mean, that whole book was just like, I am going to have defiantly, undauntedly have joy and hope in this dystopian world, you know? Um, but there's not a lot of writers who do this, I feel, and I think coming to the page, as an act of worship would really help to make that happen.
No, I think that's the main and core point, and so some sort of ancillary point that I think is related to that is this mindset that I think all of us just sort of get from the sort of cultural atmosphere we're in right now, where so many of us, whether we'd say it or not, have this assumption that the real serious art is it's bleak,
Mm.
it's dark, it's there's no happy ending. Happy endings are trite. They're for the mass market. Bleh, bleh, I'm a serious artist. Um, and you can see this in like award shows where they'll they give the Oscar to the movie with the nihilistic worldview that 15 people have seen, and that I think it's very hard for all of us, whether we're writers or whatever. We want to have this sort of thing that we want to write the serious stuff, the important stuff, and it's
Yeah.
very hard to break free from that. I think a good example of that is Jane Austen. We recorded a podcast recently. It was about this book, Jane Austen's Bookshelf. It's this really wonderful book by this author, Rebecca Romney. Um, highly recommended. And it's basically she goes through the woman authors who Jane Austen read and admired, and a lot of them wrote, like there's Anne Radcliffe who wrote gothic romances, Frances Burney who wrote kind of similar stuff to Jane Austen. And Jane Austen's point was she was basically an anti-snob, where they're all the highbrow people are like, oh, this literature, these novels, they're not the serious work that we do, for all the reasons you can expect. And she responds like, no, these novels are great. They're excellent prose. They're really insightful insights into human nature, and they're fantastic. I don't care if you very serious people respect them or not. I think these are good, and I'm gonna like them. So I think a good starting point, if you want a model for a way to do this, is be like Jane Austen.
Mhm. I was thinking as you were talking that, um, so much of it has to do with a sense of pride too.
Mm.
We get stuck in our own pride and we wanna tell the lofty story, or, write above our ability, perhaps. Um, or not be honest, you know? And we can gosh, we can sense that lack of honesty in other people's work. Um, so why aren't we more careful, in our
Mhm.
own work about being honest? Um, this book I wrote, I was like, "You know what? I'm just like I said, I'm gonna be unhinged. This is like I'm writing to my best friend who loves me, even though I'm goofy, and I'm just gonna give you the inner workings of my mind and lay it at the altar. And if you think it's horrible, that's fine, because it's me. There's nothing if you read it, you're just like, oh, there's nothing dishonest in this." I'm not trying to look good by any means to an embarrassing fault. And there was such freedom in that. Um, and I've also written things where I know that I'm I'm trying to do it myself, and I'm being prideful, and, I'm trying to teach people a certain political view or, you know, it becomes propaganda. I mean, you see that all around and you see it, you read it, and you know what it is, but no one's calling it out. It's like, this isn't art. This isn't good writing. It's propaganda. And sadly, that's what's winning awards these days, and that's what's being uplifted um, in the non-religious world, especially, but sometimes even our own, you know?
No, absolutely, and I think that's a good point to focus on. It's the fact that propaganda is almost always just very, very bad as artwork, right? And that's regardless of the message, right? Is if it can be sort of the silly kind of paint by numbers Christian romance novels, or it
Mhm.
can be the very serious and dour art house movies that win awards. That they're propaganda just for a different message.
Yeah,
So the key is to be honest and to be brave without succumbing to that, and that is a difficult thing to do, which is one of the reasons why I think we need to keep talking about this and encouraging each other because it's not an easy thing to do.
it's not. I think just staying in staying close to God, worship. When I'm lost on the page and I can't make sense of it, worship. And it makes sense. And I'm one of those people who um I don't like to just sing or read. I like to move my body somehow. So I'll go work out or lift weights or go for a walk while I'm listening to reflective music or singing. So sometimes I look a little silly because I will. I'll walk and sing. I've just I'm getting to the point that I just don't care. It's much it's much more freeing to live this way than to live in fear. I just can't do that anymore.
I love that. I love that. And that I think is a good closing thought and a good way to point our listeners back to again. It is Undaunted Joy, the revolutionary act of cultivating delight. The author, writer, the woman of letters, Shemaiah Gonzales. Where can we find you? Where can we find your work?
I have a Substack, which is where it all started. I just thought I would see if I could write about joy every week in 500 words or less, and it turned out I could. Trash bags or the squirrels outside or whatever. This week, I think I wrote about my boys' babysitters when they were little. Um, and I'm on X and Instagram and Facebook, and I just love interacting with people. Um, I mean, we talked about Jane earlier. That's really what social media like is connecting with
Mhm.
real people and sharing each other's stories and encouraging each other, pointing each other to Christ in what can sometimes seem like a dark world. And we shed light on it together through the waves and through the distance.
What a great note to close on, using social media to foster joy
Yeah.
and goodness in the world. Wouldn't you know, it is possible. It is
It is
possible.
possible.
All right, Shemaiah Gonzales, thank you so much. And listeners, as you can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have an extra, maybe 30 seconds or so to spare, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.